You're listening to Sustainably Geeky, the podcast for everyday environmentalists.
Hi, you're listening to Sustainably Geeky, episode 75. Today, I am joined by Dan Hendry, co-founder and program director of the Get on the Bus movement, driven by Small Change Fund, a Canada-based charity connecting youth to public transit. Dan, thank you so much for being on the show. I'm excited to talk about transportation and its impact on the climate crisis, and also what you guys are doing in Canada to, make our youth more confident and capable of using the transit options out there. So can you start by telling us a little bit about your background and how you became active in this space?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks again for having me. It's always great to get on a platform to kind of share different positive stories. I think that's where we're at in the world of trying to tackle the climate crisis, right? And work together. So my name's Dan Hendry. I'm from Kingston, Ontario, Canada right now. But a bit of my background, I grew up in a small town. So I really appreciated nature and getting out in it, right? And that connection to it. I have a Bachelor of Commerce I took out in Victoria, British Columbia in Canada. And then I actually went over to Sweden and did my master's in strategic leadership towards sustainability. And that was a really eye-opener, right? Working on through this with a lot of different people. And it really made me realize that like these actions that we're taking are very systemic, but they're all around us. It really comes down to how we interact with food, our water systems, electricity, energy systems, transportation, our built environment, these things that, we have around us and we're kind of using certain ways or doing things, but fundamentally a lot of them were propped up or set up on fossil fuels. And so the way I look at sustainability and the project that we're going to be talking about today too is about, well, how do we look at, analyze, and start to alter some of these both behaviors and physical environments that create some of the behaviors. So that's a little my background, and we're going to be diving into transportation for sure. So I'll be digging into that with you. But yeah, that's kind of how I got into this space and how I look at the world with sustainability and to work on different projects.
So tell us what your organization does, Get on the Bus, and what your inspiration was for starting this group.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to go back a little bit if that's okay. Just a bit in my history anyway. So when I came back to Canada, I traveled a bit and studied abroad and taught in Korea. And I came back in 2009, so I'm in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And in 2012, I kind of worked part-time with the municipality, the city of Kingston, and the local public school board, which is called Limestone District School Board. So I had these two part-time jobs in sustainability in 2010, 11. So it's a little bit early, I'd say, in the space, or at least, to have a functional job working on different projects. And there's this unique opportunity that came up in Kingston. So the city council and the trustees of the board decided to allow grade 9s to ride for free, which I thought that was a great opportunity, right? So they're about 14, they're starting high school in Canada, and they said, okay, well, let's just see what happens if we let grade 9s ride for free, right? Which I thought was amazing. But working for both organizations, and not necessarily in a job that was supposed to be doing this, but seeing this, I saw some, like anything, a good decision, but then how do you implement it, right? How does it actually get on the ground? And so there were things like students had to bring their itinerary to City Hall, and City Hall is intimidating, right? And that means the kids have to be able to get down to City Hall, which is part of the transportation problem, right? And so I saw this unique opportunity, and I went to the director of education at the time. I'm a part-time casual employee, so I was pretty confident in my thoughts. I said, listen, like, could I help try to create something from this? Can we train them? Can we help distribute the passes easier, take off the administrative burden? And so really it starts back all the way in 2012. So in Kingston, the next year, it worked pretty well. There were 28,000 grade 9 rides, and that's a 14-year-old, in high school, just starting. My daughter just went through it herself a couple years ago. And the family in Canada, when a kid goes to high school, like everyone kind of goes to high school. It's a big life transition, I'd say, for the child and for the family. But the next year they said, okay, well, how about we let grade 10s ride for free, school boards? And the school board said, okay, well, we'll chip in a little bit of money. And then the next year, grade 11, and the next year, grade 12. So systemically, year after year, we got up to all high school students in the city of Kingston getting allowed to ride for free. The thing is, we also train them in grade 9, right? We take a physical bus there, distribute the passes. It's administratively way less burdensome. Like if you think of thousands of kids going to either the mall or City Hall to do this, right? So it made it really slick. And we've won some awards from this, and this is why. The first year, there were 28,000 grade 9s. Well, year after year, when we trained grade nines and gave all grades for free, there were close to 5 to 600,000 trips a year. 5 to 600,000 trips a year, which is pretty crazy, right? Like you're thinking about, even if you times it by four, saying, okay, 28,000 times four grades, that's 120. No, it shows that as they learn, as they experience, as they grow, as they get more responsible, they use the bus more, right? And so as the master's thesis done on it, I've done a TEDx talk. Al Gore's Climate Reality Project actually picked this example in Kingston as a top 10 behavioral climate solution a couple of years ago. So it was pretty cool to see that. Now, this is where I guess I said I would have to go back to come to where we are now. It was because of all this exposure and doing it, and it's a fairly simple mechanism, other than implementing it's kind of complex because you're working between a lot of institutions and organizations and everything. And so that's when a couple of years ago I kind of hit a wall because a lot of people were calling me and saying, well, how do you do this? What about this community? Could you help us with this? And I still have a full-time job. I have a child, I have two dogs, I have a mortgage, I have my wife. We live here in Kingston. And that was really what hit me. A friend said, you need time and money. And by what that was is really just to get paid for some of this work to help. And I approached Small Change Fund, which is a national charity. And I said, listen, I've got all this work experience, network, but I need a team. And we wrote a grant and got a grant. For the past 2 years, we've been actively helping communities across Canada where they are implement some type of programming, whether it be a pilot for free for grade nines, a field trip pass, which gets kids on the bus for during the day, during non-peak hours, right? And so really that was the catalyst a couple of years ago of building and starting Get on the Bus movement through the Small Change Fund. And now it's kind of, we're building pieces, we're building programs, we're building support and resources and connections. And that was really kind of the history and got us up to speed, I'd say, Jennifer.
So you basically took what you saw as a problem in the community and turned it into an opportunity for basically big solutions, getting all the kids, all the high school age kids in your community, not only able to use the bus system, but kind of educating them on the importance of mass transit and probably the climate impacts of all that. That's incredible. And you were able to get funding for it. That's pretty impressive. Can I ask, what is the public bus system for school children in Canada? Is there one? Like in the US, we have the yellow school buses that usually will do free transportation to and from school. Does that exist in Canada?
Yeah, totally. So that's a great question because that's something like sometimes, like let's say the decision makers say, well, so how much are you gonna, is it taking yellow buses off the road, right? But Canada is very, it's a very big country. It's very sparse. Let's say different areas, right? So even our school board, we have Kingston, but we have small rural communities as well that don't have access to public transit because public transit in Ontario, where I am, the province, is predominantly focused towards the municipal government is responsible for that, right? Except for in Toronto, it's a bit bigger, Vancouver and stuff like that. Depending on the province or territory, it could be angled a little differently, but you're 100% right. The one thing that I've been very clear kind of while building this movement and working locally, this is not just about getting students to school. If they use it, if that tax-paying parent as child, right, let's say it like that, decides with the autonomy of their choice to use it to get to school, then sure, whatever. That's what it's about. But what's really cool is to see the other stats. The amount of times students are using it at nights or in the evenings, on weekends, in the summer, right? Like that means community, and I think in a time that at least I feel stress and my daughter I know feels stress with the climate crisis and let's call it poly crisis, however we want to see plastics or democracy and everything we're seeing interrelated in a kind of a crisis mode. This is something that is just about community too. It's about volunteering, getting to better work, getting to work, or like work they choose, meeting friends, that go to different high schools, helping families where that parent says, listen, I always say this to kids. Well, a fake conversation. Mom, can you pick me up? I can't pick you up there, but if you meet me downtown in 25 minutes, we'll go home together, right? Like literally more efficiency around the community for high school age students. So even though I'm a passionate person around the climate crisis, and that's what I work in sustainability. That's all I've worked in with plethora of projects. I constantly talk about how this helps so many different things. So I know I've gone a little bit off, but I've heard it so many times where it's like, well, is this replacing yellow buses? Has it taken a couple off the road in summertime because we were running summer school? Yeah, because kids can get to the centralized summer school easier for sure. And Ontario's right now, we don't get costs are going up. So sometimes different budget lines like transportation in schools, they're taking it from other pots of money because, it wasn't given enough by the provincial government type of thing. But yeah, it's definitely, there's a relation there, but it's almost kind of separate and bigger, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so the goal's not just getting kids to and from school, but it's really allowing them to have transport outside of that system and become more independent and everything. So that's great. Um, well, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but a lot of times when we start using the public transit system, it can be intimidating. Like I know the first few times I used the bus or the metro, if somebody hadn't been there to point it out to me, I probably would have, been too embarrassed or I don't know, just like felt really awkward and messed up and made some mistakes. So a lot of times I think that turns people off from using public transit and maybe just misunderstandings or misconceptions as to how it works and what they need to do. And usually once you get in there, you realize, oh, it's not that big of a deal, but it's just that first step. So your organization, as you mentioned, not only gives the free bus passes to these youth, but you teach them how to use these modes of transport. And can you explain what you teach them and why this is important?
Yeah, for sure. So, I'll back up one thing there too. Get on the bus. The movement is about helping with resource and policy. It's up to the community to execute how they do it. I do it in Kingston through my formal job role with the school board because I work part time with them. But you start anywhere. And what I've realized too, when I say training, yes, there's training. There's like stories like, I always say to some, listen, like if someone sits beside you in a public park on a bench and they make you feel real uncomfortable, would you just sit there with them? And the students like say no. And I said, that's the same as a bus. Like you're going to sit beside people. It's public transit. But if you feel uncomfortable, even on a moving bus, even on a busy bus, get up and move to the front because that driver is a City of Kingston employee and they have a radio. And again, I'm never trying to scare them. There's 500,000 to 600,000 rides a year. It's these types of tidbits, So that functional side about how to get on, where to tap, how to transfer, where to sit, take your backpack off, your music. Can you eat? I have a great story they like where it's true. You get a sign that says no smoking and no vaping, obviously, and I point that out, right? But then there's another sign that has a big cross over food, right? And I'm like, and I say to the students, can you eat? And they look at that saying no smoking, no vaping, no food. You can't eat food, right? And I'm saying to them, listen, you can have food, but here's the reason. Be reasonable, right? Have a bag of chips, a pop, coffee. Always throw or take your trash or recycling out with you too. Because one time going through Queen's University, which is a popular university here in Kingston, I saw a kid get on the bus eating a bowl of cereal. Like, I mean, a full-on porcelain bowl of Lucky Charms. So that makes them laugh. It gets them to see the extremes of why there needs to be a sign there. I also, like you said here, I do very much point out things like when we're driving, I'll say, these are not actors. Let's look outside. And we're driving down the road. I'll say, one person, one car, one person, one car, one person, one car. Just pointing out the environmental benefit. But then also talking about autonomy, about volunteering in high school, talking about freedom, and talking about how to actually figure out the bus routes, bringing up apps and getting them to show that. So it's really interactive. And when I say training, sometimes I think after I've been talking about this a lot, it's not just the training of how to, it's the why, right? It's the social benefits. It's the autonomy at their age, right? It's helping their families, right? It's getting to jobs, businesses, schools, right? So it's kind of a collective action. I have a bit of I'm not going to say a script because it just all comes out of my head. I've done, I don't even know, hundreds and hundreds of times. But the beauty of this was it was all built and informed by kids' questions over a decade, right? Like it was a parent saying, could you tell my daughter or son how to stay safe on the bus, right? It's these types of things that I pointed out, like, jobs saying, could you point out that you can get to different jobs in the community? Oh yeah, sure. Right. Like, so literally I've done this. It's like, I don't know if you've ever watched Bill Murray's Groundhog Day, but my September is like that. I get on a bus with 30 kids at a time and I do a presentation over and over and over, but it is about the how. And more importantly, is about the why as well, which I think it brings into these other factors to hopefully kind of paint the picture of freedom that they get, but with responsibility, I add.
Yeah, I know you said you point out the benefits of, how many people are traveling in a car versus a bus. Have you guys done any studies or comparisons, I guess, to school systems of a similar makeup where this doesn't exist and kind of the drivership of teens in those communities, like the amount of cars in their parking lots at school versus the ones you're at? Or,
Yeah.
I mean, I know you said it's not just for school, but do you have any idea of how many
Well, there's
teens choose not to get cars or drive at that age?
Yeah, I can't say I have any, any data that way because it wasn't something that we knew we were getting into to set up kind of the study, if that makes sense. Like we kind of
Hmm.
took 5 years to build this out and tweak it until. I would say that the school board, I've applied for a grant, and right now I'm working on through my school board job. I have to clarify this because you're kind of speaking to two Dans right now. The person who's still in Kingston, iterating this and working on it and executing it, and because I'm only part time, and then with my other time, I like to spend what I do nationally with Small Change Fund and the Get on the Bus movement. And so, yeah, locally, the one thing that's exciting is we've actually secured some funds to work. It's a little bit different, but it's an in-depth social impact and kind of cost benefit analysis, right? To really see, well, what's the value of parents' time that are now not driving their kids to school? What's that value? What's the value of the GHG reduction? And so, yes, I definitely think there's opportunity to study this further. I would say from a qualitative point of view, it's been pretty cool. I've seen some, now that students, it's been over a decade, right? Which is pretty crazy to think about. When I was at the local college, because I worked there on some contracts as well, you would have kids that, finished high school and now in college, and they would just tell you about the impact it's had on their life, right? Especially just, and you got to think those 500,000 to 600,000 rides are coming from somewhere, right? And so the one thing that I would like to say, I think it ties into, the bigger movement, as well as what you'd be passionate about, I think, as myself, is just it really kind of helps bring a multimodal lens. I'm going to say, like there's so many people that you walk out of your house, and the option is the car, right? Which is fine, right? If that's the case, but for a lot of people, like in Canada, 50% of people are living paycheck to paycheck, right? That's 50% of Canadians, right? Like our consumer debt's very high, right? The average car cost to operate, this could be even older because I've used these stats from the CAA, which is, I think, the Canadian Automobile Association, but it's like the average car cost to operate in Canada is like $13,000 a year. That's like oil, gas, insurance, car payments, all that stuff added up. And so if you have two cars in the driveway, you could be paying close to $25,000 a year after your taxes for those vehicles, right? So my point, I guess, is yeah, we haven't studied everything, but we are trying to kind of, we're working. I have some opportunities to kind of retroactively go back, but it's also, I guess the passion comes from me because I've just firsthand, I still see all the stories, if that makes sense. So it's like, that's why I'm very passionate, but you're right. I have to try, and I am working on it to try to validate it and show it different ways, right? To really get strong numbers behind it because it's there, and as youth are multimodal, when they come out of that, that means when they leave their house in the morning, some days it's the car if they have one, some days it's the bus, some days it's carpooling, and I think that's important too because it just breaks the thought process of that's the only thing I can do. And you're right when you said it earlier, people are nervous, right? A lot of times it's the adults or the teachers that get on the bus with me that say, "Oh, I haven't been on a bus in 30 years." You know what I mean? And so, yeah, I've kind of gone off there. I'm sorry if I kind of deviated a bit, but yeah, making youth multimodal, giving them those options, I think just gives them more choice and autonomy and a skill. I always highlight that no matter where they go in the world, there'll be public transit. So it gives them a skill that they can take with them, depending on what they decide to do in their lives.
No, I think that's an absolutely important mindset to be creating because I know, like I lived in Texas for most of my adult life, and now I'm living in Ireland, and the difference between the two in terms of what's available for public transit is very drastic to me. Now, if you ask the average Irish person, they would say, "Oh, our public transit is atrocious. The buses never come. The trains don't run enough." And I'm just like, "You have a system at least." In Texas, nobody thinks about taking public transit or carpooling or walking. It's very, very rare. Now, part of that is the weather. Like it's too hot to be outside, unfortunately. But just seeing the difference, myself anecdotally, and seeing how many people, even if they have a car, they'll walk places here. They think nothing of carpooling or sharing lifts or whatever because so many people don't drive. It is really interesting just to see, and it's encouraging to know that these young folks are going to be coming up already thinking that way versus having to kind of change as they get older, which we all know is much more difficult.
Yeah, no,
Um,
totally.
so we've kind of touched on this a bit already, but the implications of transportation on greenhouse gas emissions that are causing global warming are immense. What impact could improving and increasing public transit use have on this issue? And if you have any specific examples, feel free to share. But I mean, this is one of the biggest segments of greenhouse gas emissions, and we have to get a handle on it.
Yeah, and I think that's why what I've seen over the past decade doing this is important. So the parallel story to this is in 2012, the city of Kingston, I think, had about 3.5 million rides total, right? Now, the thing about public transit that's hard is you need like capacity, you need frequency, and you need reliability. So you need infrastructure, right? But you can't necessarily get that if you don't have demand and people, right? Does that make sense? Like, so to even invest or from a political point of view in that. So a really cool story in parallel to this is that the city of Kingston's ridership between 2012 and I think 2020, just before COVID, I don't have it. That was a well-timed cough. But it went up to close to 7 million rides, so doubled in those 8 year periods. And that wasn't just the youth. That was express bus services, employer pass programs. But myself and the former director that helped create this program, we've seen and know that the implication of, youth can have conversation with their family, youth can bring their mom and dad on the bus for the first time, you know what I mean? And so I think my point with this is when you're talking about GHGs in a huge port, especially in North America, where we've really designed our cities around the automobile, right? Like you're talking about Europe. I went to school in Sweden, right? And just like the physical infrastructure, of course, there's some that's a little bit sparse or whatever, but at the same time, most of it has been built, a bit differently, right? Years ago, when it wasn't, it was built more around the human and not the automobile. And so you're 100% right. I think programs like this are really important because if you can train youth, teach youth as they grow, as they use it, as that means, you have people using it more, right? And that means you can invest and create better systems for that, if that makes sense, because it's kind of a chicken and egg game with transportation, right? Especially in North America, we built around the car. Now it won't work everywhere, right? Like we've said, Canada and the United States of America are very big countries, very different countries, but also very different within them. They have very different cities and geographies and everything. So I definitely think focusing on youth while investing in public transit does create the opportunity to grow the things you need for a good public transit system. And it takes a bit of time. That's the other thing is not only does it take, it's hard to change behavior, but it's hard to sometimes change infrastructure, right? And that's what we're seeing with some of the things after hurricanes in Florida or other areas where, infrastructure takes time to rebuild, right? And so I think not just rebuild, but build. And so I love the idea of, in Canada, one thing that we're championing for is trying to get different levels of government, like the federal level of government and provincial levels of government, to put money in to help fund the operations of transportation systems based on a youth-based program. So the money would actually help get more youth on the bus that then over time helps build the ridership and the direction and the demand. And so, yeah, I think from a GHG point of view, it takes time, and I know we're urgent. And trust me, I think about that all the time. But I also have seen the ramifications. Like if you just dropped in North America, every city's free transit right now, it might actually not be, it would bog down the systems. They're not designed yet for it. They can't handle the capacity. Sometimes it could make it worse, right? So I think the idea of a youth-based program while simultaneously investing in infrastructure is a sweet spot to help reduce those greenhouse gases in the immediate and long term because of the effect that youth have on their families. And as they grow, they become multimodal. And in parallel to that, the transportation systems get better.
So what are some of the best public transit systems out there, whether it's buses, trains, metros, whatever you've seen in your experience?
Yeah, I think it really, and it's a hard question to answer in the way of like, where are we, right? I guess like I just went to, LRTs, like rail trains, are quite effective in larger cities. In fact, I just was down in Ottawa in Canada there at a conference for transit, and I jumped on the LRT and got right out of 5 stops out, and I was at a spot where my cousin picked me up and we carpooled home. But my point is that can be very effective. Trams, I think it's even things like buses, but then it's not the bus as much as in some cities, dedicated bus lanes. The fact that I could see a highway, let's say LA or somewhere else, where there's like 20 lanes and everyone's just sitting there, but yet you get 70 people in a bus. How is it fair or effective for that? So I've seen some of the best infrastructure, not just being the type of transit, but the dedicated kind of rules and around it, right? Like, so dedicated bus lanes can be an extremely effective way of getting people moved around a dense city with congestion, because on top of that, you're now showing from a behavioral point of view, listen, you can sit in traffic, but if you're willing to adapt to get on that bus, you're going to have more time in your day. Like, I can't believe the fact that we've normalized how much time we waste sitting in automobiles and get angry and pay for it. And our health degrades because of it. Like, we've normalized that. In fact, in Ontario, which is ridiculous, sorry, I'm getting angry now, but the current premier is ripping out bike lanes in Toronto because they have a majority. They just decided to all that energy and infrastructure, and the narrative around it is baffling, truthfully, right? Especially if you look at the stats, and they're using stats from 1991 to justify it. It's like, oh my gosh, where are we at? But my point, I guess, is yes, I think that. Well, actually, I went off topic and lost my train of thought. So if you can pull me back, that would be great.
We were just talking about the best types of public transit systems. So, dedicated bus lanes, bike lanes, etc., that might help
Yeah,
change behaviors.
and I think, again, it's sometimes like, and I guess that's why I went to the bike lane piece, because it's not just about public transit is fully, it's not just about a bus or a light rail train. It's about good infrastructure, right? Like, separated bike lanes can be extremely effective. There's an organization in Canada called 8 to 80, which really just talks about building your public infrastructure around, like, if you're 8 years old and younger or 80 and older. Because if it's safe in those, if your 8-year-old can go out and you feel comfortable, everybody in between is comfortable, if that makes sense. So you look at some of the best examples about, whether it be dedicated bus lanes or buses or light rail trip, all these different things. And land use planning has a huge effect on transportation as well, right? Like, because it's where we are going ultimately too, right? Like, why are we in the car? What are we trying to do, right? And so these things work together. And so I don't know if I'm doing the best job, listeners, for this one, but I do think it is kind of how all these work together, and a lot of times there's different cities and communities that are doing parts of them really well, right? I think in eastern or western states, I believe it's Washington State's doing some really neat stuff, or Portland, Oregon, especially with that dedicated bus lanes, but yeah, I think I'll tap out on this one because I don't know if I'm doing the best there.
No, but I mean, it is important to also recognize that some cities might be limited by certain things, such as their infrastructure or their history or whatever. But when you go around the world and you look at, for instance, Amsterdam is known for being a bike heavy city. They have more bikes than cars. I mean, there's a whole market for it, and you have to look out for the bikes when you're crossing, etc. That couldn't work, probably in most of the cities in the US, but it works there, and it's something that similar cities could look at or try to model after or take pieces of. Similarly, when I lived in Texas, we had a group that was looking at trying to build a bullet train through parts of Texas, and they were looking at the Japanese bullet trains as their model because apparently they had the most efficient, most on time, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it just kind of depends on, again, what places are capable of, what the communities buy into, et cetera. But yeah, in towns where there's nothing, that's where I really get frustrated. Like, we had the most embarrassing, I don't even want to call it a public transit system where I lived, because it was like one bus maybe once an hour spread over a huge city, but 5 stops or something. Like, who can actually use that, and you're outside, there's not even a cover, and it's just not user friendly. It's not meant to be used because they don't want you to, because they're not putting.
And that's exactly it. I mean, I think that's part of it. It's like, I always tell my daughter, it's like, our actions are what talk about our priority, right? And so if you're not investing in it, at all, right? And sometimes you have to invest in stuff that you want, and I think you're totally right, especially in North America. I wasn't really thinking community or city travel, but like high-speed rail, it makes complete sense. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it just is. I lived in Korea. I went to China. I went to Japan. I've been on these high-speed rail trains, and especially in Canada, if you're looking at from like Quebec City down to Windsor, which is kind of running along Ontario, it hits Ottawa, Toronto. Like, almost half our country lives in that space, right? So when you look at Canada and you say, oh, that's a big country. Well, like, not quite, but I think it's like 15 to 17 million people live between that corridor. And it's like, that makes complete sense from a density point of view. More people are on that high-speed rail, less people are going to be driving the highway. Okay, that's good because less accidents potentially, right? Or less fossil fuels, right? All that stuff, less congestion for the driver, right? And I think you always have to be able to say it different ways, but you're 100% right. Um, we are kind of, the things we invest in also talk about the priorities of, I think, what we have.
Well, and for some reason, plane travel has become the automatic, for long distance travel, but it is so much less fun. Not fun. Not that any kind of travel is fun to begin with, but it's just so much work to travel by train or plane. Sorry, you have to go through security. You have to get there 2 to 3 hours early. You have to stand in lines. You're squished in like sardines. If you're on a train or a bus, you can move around a little bit more.
Oh yeah.
You're much more comfortable. I mean, I'm not saying it's a dream or anything, but like in comparison, I would take the train every time if it was available.
Oh, we still have the Via train, which is in Canada, which I use constantly if I go to Montreal, because I'm in Kingston, so it's right in between kind of Ottawa and Toronto. And I love it because you're 100% right. I look my life because we're limited. I don't know what happens next, all that, but it's like, I got 3 hours. Am I sitting there having a coffee, working on something with the internet, with a bathroom access? Like it's like I'm just
Mhm.
in my office. Yes, it's a bit smaller or whatever, but it's moving, right? But
Mhm.
you're 100% right. For me, it's about my regained time too. If I have a limited time on this earth, then like why am I sitting in line angry at people like to fly across the same spot that it would maybe take a little bit, not longer, well, potentially longer, but it's also about factoring those times in. Like the fact
Mhm.
that some people live in traffic 1 to 2 hours a day, that's like 10 hours a week. That's a
Yeah.
lot of life. You're not getting paid for that. You're actually paying
Yeah.
to do it, right? And so, yeah, I always kind of judge my decisions. It's like, okay, what's it worth for me? Not just financially, but like that's an extra 3 hours of working or relaxing,
Or
or
reading,
watching.
yes,
Yeah,
napping,
like
whatever. You can't do that if
yeah,
you're driving.
yeah, exactly. Or even on the,
Yeah.
like you said, the plane sometimes because you're kind of constantly having checkpoints and moving through
Mhm.
it. So yeah,
Well, and I find too when you're looking at when I look at traveling places that I've never been, I have to think about, okay, will I be able to get to and from the airport?
exactly.
Usually, if you're taking the train, the mass transit in the city goes right to the train station because it's in the city. You're not having to take a separate shuttle or bus or hope that they have something. So again, it is kind of balancing out. Like, yes, it might be cheaper, it might be quote unquote less time to go to the airport, but at the end of the day, by the time you factor in the getting there early, the taking the shuttles, the all the other things, you're actually probably about the same or worse
Yeah, I
if you
think
think about it.
always depending on situation, but 100%. You living
Yeah.
in Europe and being able to, just see what you notice there firsthand. Because when I lived there in Sweden, obviously it was different than Ireland, but still, like it's like you said, like even though it's not necessarily good enough for like people are complaining about this or that, it's still like it always goes back to we don't know what we got until we don't got it or don't have it. You don't know
Yeah.
until you don't know, right? And so it's like it is good. I always really appreciated public transit when I lived in Sweden, and the trains
Hmm.
were clean and easy and comfortable. And and the one thing that baffles me though is like, and then we come back here, and you said it, and I said it earlier, and it's like, well, why can't we do that here? I always think it's crazy that we go to another country like, oh, it was so good. We biked, we took the train, we went to a cafe, we had a coffee, went to the beach. Okay, well, yeah, we can't do that back here. Well, why? Like why do we look at other places and brag about all the cool things that made it kind of human centric, and then just come back with like blinders on, saying, "Well, it's not possible here." I do
Hmm.
find that kind of baffling personally.
Yeah, rather than looking at it as inspiration, we look at it as, oh well, it'll never happen to us.
Yeah,
But
I
yeah,
can't wait to
it's
go back
strange.
there next time. Exactly.
It's strange.
Yeah.
Well, thinking about public transit systems and both inner city and intra-city, I guess. What do you see as some of the future technologies out there? Are there things that maybe most people wouldn't know about or that have been talked about that could make more efficient or more effective travel in the future?
Well, I think yeah, like so. Let's just even talk about because sometimes it's not just like the bus. So like if you're talking about like the city bus, right? So there's going to be ways depending on where you are in North America and the infrastructure where electrification is a great thing, right? And some people will say, I heard somebody say the other day actually, they said, well, I'm not going to. I think they're from Pennsylvania. And they said, well, I'm not going to buy an electric car because we use coal here, and I don't agree with that that thought process long term because your electricity can be generated renewably. Therefore, having a platform that uses a renewable energy or electricity is a great stepping stone in the right direction, right? If that makes sense, because again, it's still using gas and oil to use. But and because in Ontario, it's gone back up a bit, but we actually phased out coal. Not coal's gone back up, but we're using a little bit more gas because the current government. But we phased out coal in 2014, I believe, right? And so my point is some technologies like electric buses, right? I've seen hydrogen buses, fuel cell buses. At the end of the day, I think electric is going to be the platform that we use in a lot of times because battery technology will just get better, right? And we've seen that already, even in the last like 6 years. Like I had a friend with like a Nissan Leaf, 7 years ago, and the range is just like doubled or tripled almost, right? Like, so we're seeing that, right? And so from a physical bus point of view, I think that's one thing there. I also think other things like technologies like ticketing, right? Because it's a part of the experience that we don't always think about, right? But there's some great apps out there and things to allow for people very easy access to ticket on and off the bus. So a lot of times in public transit, we just put our money in, our ticket in, or tap, and we get on the bus. Well, that gives some information to plan, right? It gives you entry point. But in Europe and other spots, I'm seeing not just Europe, but I've seen different technologies from an app point of view about tapping when you're up, getting on the bus and getting off the bus. And this will give very real data for planning too, right? So the one thing I'm excited about, it's not necessarily just the physical infrastructure, but it's the data we can use to create more efficient systems, if that makes sense. Like because they're doing their best to plan routes and stuff, right? But you're always with public transit locally, you're always trying to do the best with what you got. There's always more places that want it, right? But would a bus once an hour be worth it? Taking that bus off on another very busy road that has a lot of people, right? So public transit authorities are constantly trying to balance their assets that way. And so I see things like different applications with real-time usage, right? Like, so just the fact that buses nowadays, even in the time period that I've been doing this programming, the idea that they can have GPS on the bus, and now you can have an app that shows you exactly when your bus is going to be there. That's the type of stuff that's really, from a technology point of view, really pushing the industry forward too, because it takes out some of the factors that people are worried about. When's my bus going to show up? Am I going to make it to work on time? Public transit, if it can't satisfy these things for people, that's why if we don't invest in it correctly or use the right technologies, people will try to choose other options because they can't not make it to work, right? You know what I mean? And so from a physical point of view, I see those types of things. Like we were just talking about earlier, I think inter-community in North America, especially high-speed trains make complete sense in a lot of time, dense areas of communities. Like I've seen some beautiful, almost, I don't know if they're like previously planned routes in the States that never happened, or like fictitious ones that could be really good based upon those stats. But it is pretty cool to see that being something that's talked about. And it's talked about, actually, I've heard that in Canada that we're going to see that's something the government may be investing in Ontario, just because the sheer density of people. So all those people on the roads that say, I don't want to take the train. Well, okay, sure. But if a whole bunch of other people on the train, it just means less usage on the roads. You know what I mean? Like, so there's benefit on both sides. I see all these types of things. I also shamelessly think that the programming that we've created in Kingston and we're working across Canada to replicate about investing in youth, and teaching them how will have a long-term effect on the usage of transit, the perception of transit, the comfort of taking transit as well. So I think, from a physical kind of technology point of view, whether it be the real-time data, using data, making things better, using electrified vehicles or other types of alternative vehicles, in some senses. And again, sometimes people come back and they say, well, it won't work here. Okay, but it will work other places, right? So we won't always have a solution that'll work for everywhere. But as we learn from each other and build these out and adapt sometimes, then there's more. I think there's a lot of good things that'll come down from the technology, from apps, from data, and then things that I'm working on, like behavioral kind of changing mechanisms that take time.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about the GPS part of it because I kind of just take it for granted now. But I do remember a long time ago when I first started using buses and transit, you didn't have that, and you just had to kind of hope the bus showed up.
Yeah.
And now I can look at the app or look at Google Maps or whatever and see, okay, it's not going to be here for 10 more minutes. I'm going to wait inside because it's always raining
Yeah.
or cold or whatever. I don't have to stand out in the rain if there's no cover or whatever. So yeah, that has really transformed, I think, a lot of it, and you just kind of take it for granted, but it is a huge driver, I think.
One for young people, or my daughter, young women especially, like it's great for safety too, right? You could be waiting in a vestibule or at somewhere, right? Like it's also, it's just a fact going back to our time, right? Like it's I always say this to students. I'll be like, you'll be like looking, you're like, oh my gosh, what? I got 5 minutes till my bus is there. You know what I mean? And it helps them plan too, to keep an eye on it, right? So
Mhm.
it's just more effective. It's safer, right? And like you said, sometimes we take it for granted, but this has really emerged in the past decade, I'd say as well, right?
Mhm.
Like definitely, I always tell the students that, do you know what a map is? And I get them kind of, oh yeah, I said, well, when I was your age,
An app
I
on
had
my
a
phone.
yeah, exactly. I said, now it's an app, but I had a map and I had to stand there
Mhm.
just hoping that the bus would come up on time. And,
Yeah.
buses aren't always late. It's not that, but they're going through, there's traffic, there's congestion, right? There's accidents, there's weather, right? So that also helps factoring all those days to make sure that, yeah, you can be effective with your time as well while waiting for it and being safe.
Yeah, and I do think having different options for long distance travel, like we talked about high speed rail, or even, we did an episode a few months ago about airships as an alternative to flying airplanes because they're, bigger. You can kind of take them longer distances, not power them with fossil fuels, etc. But having these different options out there, um, I think gives people, a way to make an impact, but also it kind of changes the way we think about travel, as we can get into more of a slow travel mindset. Right now it's all about getting there the fastest we can, but I think we kind of need to go back to the days when it might have taken us a while. And I know that sounds like a privileged stance because not everybody has the ability to take that much time off, but also sometimes maybe travel shouldn't be so easy because it is so detrimental to the environment and things. I don't know.
Well, yeah, especially with air flights. Like the one thing you mentioned there, one thing I see interesting too, it's because sometimes it's not all about people too, right? What I mean by that is like I've seen some really cool ideas about airships going north to drop off supplies in more remote communities instead of small
Mm,
planes, right? And
yeah.
they can be autonomous as well, right? You know what I mean? So like, or the fact that I've read before, I think it was Bill McGibbon that said it on Twitter at least, that if we cut out one things that we're kind of shackled, I'd say, with fossil fuels is the fact that I don't know if you knew, but I think it's about 50% of the tankers and the boat, like huge ship travel across the world, is just fossil fuels. Like it's literally
Mm,
just ships of coal going somewhere else, ships of gas going somewhere else, ships of oil.
yeah.
So as we cut off, more and more fossil fuels, truthfully, because the price per watt of wind and solar is cheaper. That's it. It's a business point of view now.
Hmm.
That's why we're seeing a boom, not just because of the good of what we believe in, because it's cheaper, right? As that goes down, there will be less demand, right? And that's what I think I'm going to say, some of the power structures globally are worried about. If we're not tied to fossil fuels, we can literally create very different economies. Um,
Yeah. I,
and so, yeah,
I think I heard that stat about the transportation of fossil fuels and how we actually use what, a third or a quarter of the fossil fuels just transporting fossil fuels, or something ridiculous.
yeah,
It's like you have to burn so much just to move it,
yeah, exactly.
whereas we
And,
could just create it in place in a lot of
yeah.
places. But
Well, and like the sun is the driver of life. That's what I studied. It's
mm,
photosynthesis. Fossil fuels, people don't always pay attention to this, but fossil fuels is the sun's energy just from a long time ago, right? It's biomass. It's through that. But the problem is it's been stored for so long in the lithosphere, the Earth's crust. When we take it out and burn it, that byproduct is what creates that unbalance, right? And
mm,
so the sun is the driver of life. It's the wind, it's the heat, right? It's the water cycle, right? It's PV, it's photosynthesis and what we get from photovoltaics. So 100%, yeah. No, that's a bit of more of my background from Sweden, but that's kind of using this stuff as the medium, as focusing with kids, and transit is my piece. But ultimately, in the back of my head is everything we just discussed, because it is about changing that power dynamic, and it is about letting the earth get back to, like, we are mammals, we
mhm.
are, like, we're biological creatures, and sometimes I think we forget that, like, you know like the earth can do what it wants to us and with us too, and we have
Yeah.
to respect that,
Yep. We're part of the system,
Mhm.
and whether we like it or not, we have to respect that system.
Yeah.
Well, bringing us back to the Get on the Bus program, what positive outcomes have you noticed in the communities where it exists? I know you've mentioned some, but what are some of the things that you would I guess point out that you're most proud of or that you've noticed?
Yeah, no, for sure. Thank you. And so it's been amazing to actually dedicate some time and work on this with the Small Change Fund, right? Because when I did my TEDx or when we were working with Al Gore's Climate Reality Project, that was just me on top of my full-time jobs because I'm passionate. Every phone call I've taken over the past decade. And so it's great to have a platform, get on the bus, right? .ca if you check it out, a platform to like work with other communities. So one of the coolest things, part of it is too, like, again, I'm saying we don't own it, right? It's an idea, right? But we work where they are at. So Halifax, which is on the east coast of Canada in Nova Scotia, it's a larger community than Kingston, and they've started a couple pilots based upon my work in 2019. But this year we've talked to them with Get on the Bus and worked through them to as they adapted. It was just this September that I got an email from the director that said, "Pay attention." And I kind of paid attention, and a couple of days later, there was a provincial announcement that said that 28,000 high school students in Halifax were getting a free bus pass based upon this work. And so, honestly, I don't cry too much personally, yet alone professionally. But when I got that news, it was definitely overwhelming to know that for a decade working locally, refining it, for the past 2, 3 years working nationally with Small Change Fund to grow it and build it. Um, the ripples hit Halifax, and those kids, whether it be the disposable income of some parents that now they have a bit more money, right, or new kids learning how to get around, or getting a job, or getting to school, or getting to health, appointments, or meeting friends. Uh, it was pretty overwhelming. So that was one that I thought was really cool. Um, Another one was a little bit different. Remember, the core is about getting kids on the bus or youth on the bus for free. And so TTC, which is the Toronto Transit Commission, I did a delegation there. I was asked to, so I got 5 minutes to talk. That's all they give you. But they grilled me for like 40 minutes. And I'm talking about like they asked me just a ton of questions, which was great. But they actually this year passed a field trip program, which means on Mondays and Fridays in the city of Toronto, uh, grades 7 through 12 can you do use field trips, so it's more of an educational component, right? Get down to the ROM, which is a museum, or wherever they're going to go, right? And so that was pretty cool too, because that kind of shows an adaptation with the same thought process, but to Canada's largest city, and so it's a bit different. It's not like they all have it, but it goes back to what I was saying before. If you just dropped everyone for free, the actual transit system couldn't handle it, right? So it's a nice way to show and spark the conversation about getting youth on the bus for free and showing the benefits of for the community, parents, schools. Those were two of this, I'd say, two of the most not just significant. Like there's communities across Canada I've helped. There's about 17 communities across Canada working on some type of idea around this. Again, we don't own them all. It's not about ownership. It's about inspiring and support, right? And so, yeah, and then the more and more people that reach out, it seems now that they're kind of getting the ball rolling, if that makes sense. There's just been more and more, even on the weekend. Two different communities reached out via the website, so I have to get to them today. But I think it's just, I meet anybody who just wants to talk about it. Is it a grassroots organization? Is it a city councillor? Is it is it a politician? Is it a parent? Who wants to talk about this? Because I like talking about it. So yeah, those would be some of the things that made me kind of feel really good about what we're doing.
Well, you preempted my next question, which is, what advice would you offer communities looking to do the same thing? And maybe you have like a stock curriculum you hand them, or you give them, kind of individual advice. Do you guys have anything like that, or do you just kind of take it case by case?
Well, we're kind of working on both sides of that. So we take it case by case because you really have to start where they're at, right? Like, who's contacting you? Are we getting through the politicians certain way? Like, who's gonna, like what's the local flavor, like who's contacting. I think that's one main thing, like who's really digging into looking into this. Because the other thing we haven't talked, we talked a little bit about, but is the training aspect. So yes, like there are some resources we're working on to like basically package what I've learned for the past decade of like a how-to guide, build a training program, right? So it's kind of like that. So some communities are asking about that, but truthfully, most are starting to figure out how to like start a program around the free for youth. Like how would it be executed? What type of passes? What students? And whether it's brought up from a political point of view, a staff point of view, a grassroots point of view, my biggest advice for any community is just start somewhere, right? Like I've seen astronomical numbers. One community, Guelph, Ontario, said, well, we can't do this because if we do this, it'll cost $1.1 million. And I'm like, what assumptions have you made to put that number in place? Like Halifax just gave 28,000 students free bus passes and it cost them 1.8 million. So how are you doing 2 or 3 classes for 1 million? You know what I mean? So my point is sometimes communities don't necessarily, at the staff level, they're overburdened and they want to try to figure things out, but they might not want to start. They say, well, if we had 600,000 rides, then we would need more buses. And so the decade of work that it's taken is you're going to get the first year. Good luck, but I think it is about starting somewhere. That's all I say. Go ahead.
Well, and it's also, people that just want to throw out the monetary cost of things, it's like there's more to it than money. The benefits you've listed throughout this conversation, it might actually, if you did an assessment, save them money in the long run.
Well, exactly.
And when you look at the emissions savings and all that, so I guess it's a lot of educating people on that too, to look at more than just the numbers, because I think that's how we're trained in North America, is just to see what's it going to cost me, but you don't look about the cost of inaction or
exactly. And that's
why
we're working on, like through my Limestone role, we've got that grant to work on a very in-depth cost-benefit analysis to pull in those other factors. So because here's the thing, like municipalities generally own their theater, or they might have a farmer's market or a museum, right? Across North America, the municipalities have other departments that want to do stuff with youth. You know what I mean? Maybe the rec center. Well, how are you getting them there, right? So like you literally are paying employees in other buildings to want youth to come to them. But this is just another way to maximize. And I like saying that it's like a maximize, and it's amplifying other investments, right? Does that make sense? Like you have an employee that wants kids to come to the museum. This makes it easier for kids to come to the museum. That's it, right? On a field trip, right? So it's like you said, it's about that bigger picture, and about some of the other values, So yeah, no, my biggest advice though is if it gets brought up in a community, if you're pushing for it, be patient because it's hard, but try to start somewhere. One grade, one class, one group, doesn't matter. Because the other thing is, you don't really need necessarily municipal buy-in. What you need is to pay for passes for those youth, right? So if you had a grant that could get one grade free passes and those kids signed up for it, you don't need the transit authority to just give them free. You can pay for them through a grant, right? So that's the type of thinking too. But I would just start somewhere and not let the conversation die, because sometimes it's hard. We're like, oh, we looked at that and we decided it didn't make sense. So that was the decision, right? We don't want that aspect. What we want is, well, let's start somewhere small and see how it goes, and ask kids what they think and parents what they think,
Yeah, the old argument of this is how we've always done it, so we can't change.
Exactly. We don't want to get to that point, with it's passed because of maybe, staff that wrote a report that's not totally, as robust as it could be, or maybe with the idea that they're overwhelmed and they can't handle more, or, we want to just start somewhere. And that's what I advise any community, just let's try to start somewhere and then get kids' voices, right? Because we always say kids are the future. Oh, climate, that's their future. No, I'm going to be 70 years old. I don't want to be living in some of the environmental pieces that I hear about. It's our future, and we owe it to kids and youth to give them a better chance in all this for a happy life, and that's what I think this helps with.
Yeah, we shouldn't be pushing the problems onto them when they didn't even cause them to begin with.
No.
Well, Dan, we've talked about a lot the last hour. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you might want to talk about now, or?
No, I think just like anyone across, wherever you're from, if you're listening to this, if you check out getonthebus.ca, if you want to reach out to me, I've done some different podcasts before, which has been always inspirational when, somebody reached out from Australia or like, just any opinion. So please don't feel free to look me up and reach out if you're interested in learning more. I would also say, yeah, that's really it. I mean, just if you're in the transportation space or youth space, this is something that I didn't know when I was, I didn't know when I was helping start this that it would literally just take over my life in a way of passion, right? So, but the passion comes because of my drive to do, I think, my understanding of the dire need for the climate crisis and the need for connection and community and this, maybe a new story of how we can live together in some way. And so please just feel free to reach out.
Well, yeah, you've done incredible work through this organization and program, and I think, yeah, you've probably, inspired a lot of folks in their own communities that want to do something different. So, thank you for sharing your journey and information. And what resources would you share with folks that want to learn more about transportation or what you're doing, or anything you think is important?
Yeah, I think the best, again, getonthebus.ca or actually dhendry.com. That's my personal website that has a very specific resources around Kingston, dhendry.com. Both of those are kind of different elements of the story. There's the national movement and then a lot more in-depth stuff around Kingston. The Kingston stuff has stuff like a master's thesis. So I can tell you that grade 9s use it or grade 12s use the pass in Kingston 3 times more than grade 9s, right? There's a master's thesis done. There's the Al Gore's Climate Reality. There's different resources that were built around Kingston there at dhendry.com, but really dig into the national movement because what's cool about that, it has links out to like all the different communities that are doing it, how they're doing it, how they're paying for it, how they're monitoring it, what they're trying to get out of it. So that getonthebus.ca, driven by the Small Change Fund, is a great resource to check out this stuff. And I mean, I'm sure there's some other great stuff, but I'll just point towards that because more people on the bus is a good thing. So
Yeah, definitely. Well, I guess we'll move on now to our green life hack portion of the show, and this is where we'd share a green life hack for listeners to implement in their own lives if they're looking for ways to live more sustainably. So, Dan, do you want to start us out?
well, I think just going back on topic, on brand, let's say with the bus, like we talked about before, like when I go to Toronto or Ottawa, and I use the bus locally, so maybe not me, but when people go to bigger cities, they use transit. Or when people travel to a different part of the country or world that has good transit, they use transit. So I guess my my green life hack would just be more challenge yourself locally to try to use some different modes of transportation in your everyday life. Whether it be biking, walking, carpooling, or transit and try to become a little bit more, from a mindset point of view, multimodal. And what I mean by that is when you leave in the morning, how are you going to get there? A lot of people don't think about it. They think one way, they get in the car, right? And so my life and my wife and my daughter, it's a little conversation. It's like, okay, well, how are we getting around today? And, the one benefit is we only have one car compared to a lot of families that might have two. So we're saving money there. For us, it's also a cost benefit thing there. So I would just say, try to, in your everyday life, picture you're in Amsterdam or a place with a beautiful infrastructure, and just try to make a couple choices to change up your day-to-day behavior because we lean on that and don't always think about it, right? And so I would just challenge yourself in your day-to-day, even for a period, a week or a month, to try to become a bit more multimodal.
Yeah, you actually, this has never happened before, but you said the exact thing I was going to say, which is challenge yourself to try a new form of transit, and especially if you live somewhere where the car is your primary way of getting around. If you're in a place that doesn't have buses, maybe walk down to the corner store if you can, or take the bike, or if you're traveling long distance, think about the train or the ferry if that's an option. I last year, tried the ferry instead of flying, and it is harder to do on foot without a car, but it is possible. And just maybe research different ways to travel long distances, and if you're going short distances, don't drive. So.
Yeah, because like the truth is, there's the day to day. There's a lot of little things we can do. Transportation is hard, right? So that's why it's important we focus on that too, the best we can, because it is a significant portion of our GHGs in North America, or at least in Canada. And it's a hard one to get to. So I think all the little actions add up.
Yeah. And you're getting exercise while you're at it. So if you're walking or
Exactly.
biking, so there you go. Well, Dan, thanks again for sharing all about your journey and the great work you're doing in Canada. Where can folks find you and your organization online?
Yeah, so getonthebus.ca, dhendry.com, or checked out LinkedIn, myself, Daniel Hendry or Dan Hendry. And I'm sure some of these will be linked in the promotions. So check it out there and yeah, just connect.
Great. Yeah, we will link all of these resources and everything you've heard about in the show in our show notes. So if you're interested in looking that up, it'll be there. You can find the show anywhere you listen to podcasts on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And now we are on buymeacoffee.com. So if you want to support the show, you can go there and /Sustainably Geeky, and you can buy us a plant, in our case, not a coffee. And of course, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Het's Gonna Be Me, here on Sustainably Geeky, and occasionally on our parent show, Epically Geeky and Marginally Geeky. So thank you for listening. Dan, thanks again for being on, and everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.